Hey, and welcome to the Ninjababes Podcast. What's up? I'm back and I'm here with Amy Harski. Amy is also back. So we did an episode a few weeks or maybe months ago now at this point talking about pregnancy and postpartum training. So we're actually going to jump back into that topic today because there are some things that we did not quite get to. We're going to talk more in depth about training during pregnancy or what is happening during pregnancy that we need to know as athletes. And then we're going to answer, I think, about 8 questions that came in from listeners. So I'm really excited to get to those questions. Some of them are really amusing and answers that I definitely want to know. So can't wait to get to that. But let me remind you who we have here. So Amy Harski is not only a ninja, but she is a personal trainer. And she has additional certifications and training in working with women who are pregnant or training during postpartum, and just how to help those women be their best, train at their best, train safely. And so I love talking about this topic because it's so interesting to me. And you might know more about the history or like the stigma or whatever than I do. But I feel like in the past it was just like, oh yeah, don't exercise. Like something bad might happen.
I
feel like they're
walk, maybe do yoga.
Yes, walk around, start pushing that stroller, get in those stroller.
Get good at the stroller pushes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but now we realize that there is more that we can do during training safely. As of course, if it's always okayed by your doctor, make sure that you are healthy and in a good place to train while you're pregnant. So just as a reminder, everything we're going to talk about in this episode are general recommendations. So everyone is different. Everyone has a different experience during pregnancy. So make sure you consult your doctor before you just follow any advice that's out there. So Amy, it's great to have you back. As I just said, today we're going to kind of start with preconception and then talk about during pregnancy. And I think some of our questions might touch on postpartum, but in the last episode, we were talking a lot more about postpartum training. Today is more during pregnancy. And just right before I hand it over, I just want to say again, you might be listening and you're like, oh, I don't know if I really need to listen to this episode because I'm not pregnant or I'm not a mom right now or whatever. But you might be a mom in the future, or you probably have or had a mom at some point, and maybe you can relate on some level, whether it's your friend or your coworker or a ninja at the gym, that it might just be really cool to hear about what that mom's experience has been like and help you relate a little bit more. Or again, maybe you're a father listening or somebody else who just feels a little bit separated from this conversation, but I encourage you to listen. You never know what you might learn. So Amy, it's so good to have you back on the podcast. I'm really excited to jump into this information because we got so much good feedback from the last episode. So Amy, thanks for being back.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. So we'll start off with some preconception stuff. So just going into pregnancy, really the best thing you can do to set yourself up is just being healthy in general. So everybody on here is probably already exercising, which is awesome. Sleep, stress, eating really well, just making sure that you're in a good spot before you get pregnant. And I know you kind of talked about your shoulder surgery and how they told you, ahead of time, do your prehab. The stronger you are going in, the better it is coming out. And the same really applies to pregnancy. The best way to set yourself up for a good postpartum recovery is to go into your pregnancy super fit and strong. But as far as athletes, I think one thing worth mentioning, especially in a sport like ninja, where it's really perceived that a low body weight can be advantageous, is just making sure that you're getting plenty of food and fueling your body properly, making sure that you have regular periods. And I know that you've covered this in other episodes, but a lot of women don't know that they can actually be bleeding on a pretty regular basis, but not ovulating. So making sure that you're actually ovulating, your body's in a really good spot for pregnancy. Because working out a lot and not eating sufficiently isn't the best for us as women.
Yes, not really best for anyone, but especially for women trying to get pregnant. But I know we've learned it on the podcast before, like you mentioned, that having a regular period is actually a good indicator of your health overall. And just that your body's hormones and all of the balances are in check, are in balance, and are working optimally, I guess you could say. And so it is a good indicator of what's kind of going on in the inside. So
exactly. Yeah. Even if you're not trying to conceive, you want to have a really healthy period because it's an indication that your body overall is in a healthy spot.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So let's assume, I'm good. I'm ready.
Now
I'm
you're pregnant?
ovulating. I'm strong. Got it going. Okay. So, so what's next then? If I got pregnant right now, what do I need to know?
If I got pregnant right now. Yeah, so
well, not like right now, but like
well, yeah, no.
this week.
Yeah, so as soon as so first trimester, you probably won't know you're pregnant obviously until a few weeks in. So you'll probably be doing everything in your normal life. I did UNAA nationals or worlds, whatever they call it, a couple years ago. I was pregnant. I didn't know it yet.
Oh, wow.
But once you find out you are pregnant, at that 4 to 6 week mark, usually, is often the same time that women start experiencing some symptoms to do with pregnancy. So you might notice that you're a little bit more fatigued. Fatigue is super common during the first trimester. A lot of women experience nausea, and there's a big range. Like, I'm pretty lucky. Like, I have like very occasional mild nausea. And then some women, it's very severe nausea, or they're actually vomiting, having trouble keeping any food down. And so that can last anywhere from, just a few weeks, or some women it lasts the entire pregnancy. So training during your first trimester is really going to be based a lot on how you're feeling. And so I was lucky, again, like I had easy first trimesters. I was maybe a little bit tired, but that's about it. And so I was able to pretty much continue eating normally, continue training very normally. Because first trimester, there's really not a lot of considerations about the baby per se, because the baby's still tiny. But you do mostly have to do modifications based around how you're feeling. So some women, especially like really athletic women, it can be hard because they're training really hard. They're doing all this stuff, and then they just feel crappy. They're so fatigued. They can't keep anything down. All the food just sounds terrible. They don't want it. And so like mentally it can be really hard too, because they're so used to working out and it's part of their mental health. And then all of a sudden they're just sitting around and they feel terrible and they feel like they're doing nothing. And so first trimester, you got to kind of give yourself a little bit of grace based around, how you're feeling. And even if you are on that end where you're having a really rough first trimester, finding little things that you can still do that are part of like what you enjoy. So maybe you can't train really hard, but you enjoy being outdoors and you can still go on short walks outdoors. Or maybe you can still do some stretching or mobility work where you're at least moving around. And that actually can help with nausea. So sometimes movement will help with nausea. The other kind of counterintuitive thing is that a lot of times eating food can help with nausea. So if you can find small amounts of food that you can keep down, even if it's like a cracker or a couple of crackers, because sometimes going a long period of time without food is actually one of the things that will trigger nausea for women. And then the other thing is just, from a practical perspective, finding like what you can still eat. So that's another thing a lot of times I work with women on, is figuring out ways to get some calories and especially some protein into their bodies. Because protein aversions, like aversions to meat, are often pretty common. And so sometimes things like Greek yogurt or like cottage cheese, or adding some protein powder to a cold smoothie, can be a lot easier to stomach than like a big old steak or something.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, meat aversions are really, really super common. But yeah, and first trimester, also not stressing about, because it's actually fairly common for women to lose weight during their first trimester, because either they're so averse to eating or they are having trouble keeping things down. And baby will be okay. It's a really stressful thing sometimes when we're unable to eat. But that's a really, really common thing. So obviously be talking to your doctor, but don't stress too much. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And you kind of answered this, I think, already, but I was thinking while you're talking, if there is a woman who feels pretty good on, like maybe you, for example, felt good on during first trimester and was able to train, you mentioned that it's if you're falling, like in Ninja, obviously we fall all the time. If you're falling, if you're doing like heavy movements or like a lot of like abrupt movements and things like that, that's still okay during first trimester for the baby?
So yeah, so first trimester, like I said, a lot of people or women, especially if they weren't, you know, maybe they weren't planning to get pregnant, they may not realize until they're 8-9 weeks in and they've just been doing everything that they normally do. And exercise, I know that miscarriage it's very common during the first trimester. It's about 1/5 of pregnancies actually will end in miscarriage. And so a lot of women have fear around exercising and miscarriage, but there's not a risk of exercise, you know, causing miscarriage. And that's something they've done really big studies on. So you're totally okay to exercise. Baby's very small. And so like your risk of like falling and that sort of thing is really not a concern yet. The things that you do want to avoid are like hot temperatures. And so that would be hot tubs, hot yoga. If you live in a really hot climate, especially if it's humid, you just don't want to overheat during the first trimester, or really any time during pregnancy. So training where the temperature is moderate, making sure you stay really well hydrated, is a big one first trimester. But yeah, you don't really need to change your training up much beyond, you know, just kind of what you're feeling up to.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's good to know. I feel like there's so many easy worries that can come in there. Like you said, like, oh, if I fall, I'm just gonna shake it up too much, or like what could happen? I don't know. But that's also funny that I'm like prefacing this joke right now, but you know how they say like bun in the oven, but apparently like don't turn up the temperature too hot. Like don't.
It's funny. That's actually how I announced to my husband that I was pregnant the first time, was like I put a actual bun in our actual oven. It took him a long time to figure out what was going on.
Were you like, go look in the oven? Like, what did you...
I was like, I have a surprise for you in the kitchen. And he's like, are we having burgers? And I'm like, no. No.
That's funny.
Oh,
okay.
But yeah, it's really easy to let the worries creep in, but really, first trimester, like, again, it's mostly limited by how you feel. You're really not supposed to train at the super, super high intensities, like all out, at all during pregnancy. But like first trimester, nobody's doing that anyway. Like even I felt good. And, you don't have the same kind of like energy during a workout. You can feel like you're really lagging. And I think part of that is probably a blood volume thing. And people often, like women, feel bad. They're like, man, I feel so out of shape. I get out of breath so easy. And partly it's hormonal, but partly your blood volume, like throughout pregnancy, increases by about 40%. And a good portion of that is during the first trimester. So your heart is actually working a lot harder, even though the baby is tiny. Your blood volume increases by like 30%, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, that I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so your heart is actually working much harder during pregnancy than normal. Yeah, so if you go in good, another one, like go in well conditioned, relatively, that increased stress is going to be easier to handle than if you go into pregnancy very deconditioned.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cardio. It always comes back to the cardio.
I'm so bad at doing cardio. But I'm like, oh, does it last more than 30 seconds? I'm out.
I know. I'm always like, I'm built to sprint, and that's it.
Yeah.
Sprint, done. Anyways. Okay. Cool. So second trimester.
Yeah. So second trimester, most women, the vast majority, are going to start to feel a lot better, both in terms of the nausea and the fatigue. And it's kind of funny. It's often just almost like this, like click, like, oh, it's second trimester. It's all gone now. I feel good. And so second trimester is kind of the honeymoon trimester in terms of training, because you normally have your energy back. You normally are able to eat more normally. The nausea's gone. And your belly, you have the little belly, but it's like the cute belly. It's not the belly that's in the way and uncomfortable yet. So second trimester women often feel really good training. And again, for the most part, you can kind of continue to do what you normally do, but we start to have some considerations around kind of the changes that are taking place in your core. Because now you have your belly expanding, and you have, the baby's getting bigger. You have a little bit more kind of pressure down on the pelvic floor just because there's more stuff inside that it's holding up. And so that's when we start just being aware of symptoms and making modifications as we need to. So what that kind of looks like is, in terms of the core, I know we kind of talked about diastasis last time and what that is. And so as your rectus muscles kind of move apart and that connective tissue between them gets stretched out, as you're doing kind of core dominant exercises, you might start to notice what's called coning. So your pregnant belly should just be like this nice round belly. And then let's say you try to do a sit up, or you're hanging and you're lifting your knees or your legs, and you kind of see the middle of your belly kind of like pop into this more like triangular shape versus being round. That's kind of your intra-abdominal pressure pushing out on that connective tissue, on that linea alba, as you do the movement. Now, we don't know whether or not, kind of consistently doing that will cause women to have more of a diastasis or a worse diastasis. But kind of the general consensus right now is it's probably better to avoid that extra pressure out on the linea alba. And again, it's not like doing this once or twice. Like if you see it like, oh no, I coned, this is bad. You could just use it as an indicator that maybe that exercise just needs to be stepped down a little bit. Because I do like to continue doing core exercises throughout your whole pregnancy, so that you don't come out with this super weak abdominal wall because you avoided all core exercises because you were afraid of a diastasis. It's just that we may need to start kind of toning them down a little bit as we start to notice that coning. And it's Go ahead.
I was going to say, would this then be a good time, or should you have already been doing like pelvic floor exercises and core strengthening? Like would that have been good to just have done already and then continue doing and then maybe tone it down?
So core exercises, like hopefully you've been doing them going into pregnancy and your first trimester. I'm assuming everybody here was working out, and doing Ninja is really good core exercise. People don't think of it as that, but if you're hanging and swinging, it actually requires a lot of core strength. And so I'm assuming that you were doing that going in, but if you weren't, then yes, you should strengthen your core, especially early on before things start to get stretched out. As far as the pelvic floor, and we can talk more about this later, I like to introduce it early, basically whenever there's time, often first trimester, just because, if somebody's having a really rough first trimester, it's something that they can do that doesn't require a lot of energy. Because if you can invest some time into the pelvic floor exercises, I think it gives you a lot of benefits later on. So third trimester, it starts to be really common for women to experience some stress urinary incontinence, so leaking a little bit. And if you do pelvic floor exercises early in pregnancy, it's been shown to reduce that. The other big reasons that I say to do it are because it's really going to give you a leg up postpartum. Because learning how to contract your pelvic floor can be a learning process for women. And then learning how to contract their pelvic floor, while integrating that into movement. Again, it's kind of teaching your body a new skill in a way. And so if you try to jump into that postpartum, it's super hard because that muscle just got really stretched out and it can be really hard to connect to your pelvic floor. And so if you didn't have that good ability already, then it's a much harder time to start trying to do that. So the short answer is yes, if you set yourself up early, that's a really good idea. And the pelvic floor, it kind of talks to your core muscles off as well. So if you contract your pelvic floor, it works with your transversus abdominis, which is your deepest core muscle. And so one of the modifications that I often have women do if they are experiencing coning is to do pre-contract their pelvic floor before they try the exercise. And maybe do a little bit of an exhale to reduce the pressure. And a lot of times then they can do the same exercise without coning, just by kind of changing their strategy.
I'm sitting here feeling my core trying to do what you're saying.
Does that happen? Yeah.
I'm like, wait.
So the best place to try to feel it, if you want to try to feel it on yourself, is if you lay on your back, and then your hip bones in the front. So if you kind of dig your fingers in just to the inside of your hip bone, and then contract your pelvic floor, you should feel this gentle pressure like up on your fingers, and that's your TA contracting. Your transversus abdominis. Yeah, so you can kind of test and like, which I don't necessarily like to like cue TA contractions unless somebody really needs it, but because most of this stuff should be happening automatically. Yeah. But it's kind of fun to like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. If I contract my pelvic floor, my abs move.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can show some like video clips of this in bonus material or for social media. So people know what we're talking about.
What we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to see the TA contract because basically it's a muscle that kind of just wraps around like a corset. It's your deepest core muscle. And so when it contracts, it basically draws your belly in. So in yoga sometimes or different places, you'll hear the cue to like draw your belly button like back to your backbone. That's contracting your TA. So it just kind of like pulls everything in.
That makes sense.
So with the Ninja, the two considerations in terms of three really, what you're going to continue to do. One of them would be diastasis and what's going on with your core. So like I said earlier, a lot of Ninja actually requires a really good amount of core strength and core involvement. And a lot of times we don't really think about it. But sometime like, mid second trimester is a lot of times when you're really going to start to notice that if you're hanging or doing pull-ups or swinging, you might start to see that coning. And so for me, that's a sign to take a step back. Like everybody, like I said, we don't know for sure, and everybody makes their own choices. But for me, I'm like, you know what? I don't need to do it. And the thing that's fun for me about Ninja is like the really big moves and learning new skills and trying different stuff. And so at that point, I was pretty happy just to take it out. But you could also just kind of step back and find different versions of things where you don't have coning. But things like a lâché, like if you look at the catch on a lâché, that's a really like hard abdominal contraction. That's a really big eccentric load on your abs. And so that's when you're probably going to see that coning and stuff. And so again, some people choose to keep doing them, but I personally probably wouldn't. Once you see that.
I have another question about second trimester. Okay, so for those people listening who might also work in a Ninja gym or be coaches, everyone knows when you spot, it's quite frequent that you get kicked. Do you think getting kicked is, probably not a good thing? If you're getting kicked like in the stomach or the core?
If you're getting kicked in the stomach. But again though, it's something where I wouldn't have like a lot of fear about it. But yeah, if you're spotting people where you might be taking like a foot directly to the belly, it might be best to, have another coach do that type of thing. We don't have a lot of like data on what kind of impact it would take to actually like hurt a baby, but it seems to be quite high from like car crashes and stuff. Like it's not like a little bump to your belly is going to do something.
Yeah. That's true.
But still better to avoid kicks than like
but
if it does happen, I wouldn't be like, oh my gosh,
the baby freak out on the child that just kicked you. No, probably not a good idea. It gets so funny, like when I'm spotting in the gym, kids, if you get kicked or like slapped like frequently if they're, a little crazy on the bars, and they not a lot of times, but sometimes they'll turn around and be like, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, it's fine. Like, it's part of the process. I expect it. It's fine.
I was standing here. I know you didn't do it on purpose. Like,
I know. It's like, but my mom actually, when she was pregnant with me, was in a car accident. I totally forgot about that until you said it. So, and, I think I turned out pretty fine. So
we think you're okay. We haven't found out nothing major yet anyway. We don't know.
What are people not telling me? I don't know. Okay.
But cool, so there's a lot of cushioning around baby. Like, so little bumps to the belly, like I wouldn't be paranoid about. But yeah, as far as like ninja second trimesters, yeah. So one consideration is the coning and the doming. And again, I wouldn't freak out if you see it here or there, but for me personally, like it's like a risk reward question, and like we don't really know what causes some people to get a worse diastasis. But if I lose a little bit of extra core strength, like I can get that back super quickly. But if you do end up with more stretching than maybe you had to have, that's going to take a long time to rehab, because that connective tissue just doesn't regenerate as, you know, it's not the same as a muscle. It's kind of like if you think about a tendon injury, it's usually going to take longer. And so I just like to, you know, I kind of think of things as like a risk reward. And then also like a why do I want to do this? And so, you know, like why do I still want to do whatever it might be, like laches? And if the answer is like, well, I'm afraid that if I take these out, that postpartum, it's going to take me longer to get them back. I don't think fear is ever a good motivator. It doesn't lead us to make good decisions. And like we talked about last time, like that stuff comes back really quickly. As soon as you have the strength back, like skill loss is something I would not worry about at all during pregnancy. Those motor connections, like that comes back really, really quickly. And even strength loss, like, I mean, I really focus on strength training, but you know, strength comes back pretty quickly. And so like, that's very easy to get back. On the other hand, like if you get injured and you're pregnant, even if like, you know, baby's fine, most likely baby's going to be fine. But now the rest of my pregnancy, I'm dealing with the discomfort of a baby, and I'm trying to, like, you know, this giant belly, and I'm trying to get over an injury. And to me, that's just not worth it. I want to be able to train my whole pregnancy. I don't want to have pain. I don't want to have injuries. And so I'd rather kind of stick towards like a little bit like safer exercises. And that's my choice. Yeah. Which, like, you know, kind of comes down to like the ninja training. Also, there's the risk of falling. And so generally, like anything where you risk falling is contraindicated in pregnancy. Like, just if you look at general recommendations, it's like no downhill skiing, like don't ride horses. But with the ninja, like, again, like I'm honestly not super concerned about, like, we know how to fall. Like, you're not going to fall directly on your belly. Like, it'd be hard for me to conceive of a way to fall that you're actually going to hurt the baby. On the other hand, you may injure yourself, like, especially if you're trying to come down in a way that you don't hurt the baby.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And the other thing is, it's like, you know, we train so much how to fall the right way or how to fall and roll the right way, but I'm trying to imagine trying to do like a really swift roll with like a large stomach that I'm not used to, like, navigating. Yeah. Like, yeah, I don't know about that.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Sometimes when we talk about pregnancy, we always talk about like risks to the baby, and we almost never talk about like the mom, which, like, I mean, obviously the baby is the priority. But the reality is there's not that many things that are going to be like super high risk for the baby. As long as you're like staying within the realm of, like, you know, not absolutely crazy. And you're not like obviously overheating or getting your heart rate up super, super high. Like the baby's going to be fine. But like with the risk of falling also, like, yeah, we don't want to fall on our belly, but like, we don't want to injure ourselves, because like, that's really going to put you further behind in like returning to ninja later, or even just feeling comfortable during your pregnancy, because like end of pregnancy is just, it's not comfortable. Like as that baby gets huge, you're just like even rolling over in bed is like an ordeal. You're like, all right, let me prep. And so like, I don't want to add any additional discomfort. So, you know, risk of injury, like risk reward is always kind of a consideration there. And then the last consideration with ninja training is kind of pelvic floor related. And so if you're looking at falling, jumping, anything with a lot of impact, or even if you look at really difficult movements. So if you look at something like, if you're trying to do like a really long lache, you're going to have this big increase in intra-abdominal pressure. And on landings, you have this increased pressure on the pelvic floor. And so those are the skills that sometimes would trigger leaking in somebody that has some pelvic floor issues. But during pregnancy, we want to consider that, now we also have this additional stress on the pelvic floor, this additional weight coming from the baby. And so like doing a bunch of jumping or a bunch of, landings or things with really high intra-abdominal pressure may be putting a lot of stress on the pelvic floor. And so impact activities in general, I usually back off somewhere between like early second trimester, like if somebody already had pelvic floor issues from previous pregnancy, to like, somewhere in the third trimester. Like for me, I removed impact for myself at about 18 or 20 weeks, both pregnancies. And it wasn't really because of any issues. It was just because for me, it stopped feeling good then. And I work out because I enjoy it. And so I can do other options that don't feel uncomfortable. It just feels weird. It's like your belly's like kind of bouncing. There's like this wailing. I just don't like it.
Yeah.
Because to me, like we're exercising for our health and enjoyment. So like if you don't enjoy it anymore, if it doesn't feel good anymore, then just like there's a lot of things that you can do. Just take it out.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. So then moving towards third trimester, obviously baby now has grown a lot and we're thinking about birth happening in the near future.
Yes. Yeah. So third trimester, baby grows from somewhere around like, I think like just under 2 pounds to however big they end up. So most of the growth of the actual baby takes place during the third trimester. And so a lot of times, like I said, second trimester, like women will still feel comfortable, like athletes especially, doing a really wide variety of exercises. And then third trimester, especially late third trimester, is when things start to get like a little bit more uncomfortable. I can speak for myself because I went late with both my babies and they were both giant babies. And so I was just like, just physically, it's uncomfortable. You have like a 15-pound bowling ball inside your abdominal wall by the time you take into account the baby plus the placenta and the fluid and the increased size of your uterus. Like, but like the good news is like, I stayed I worked out my whole pregnancies and I was really grateful in my third trimester because other than literally just, the kind of discomfort of having like that much stuff inside you, I felt really good. I felt strong. I was still able to do all of my living activities. I was still able to work. I was still able to work out, could carry my kid around, and I still felt great doing everything.
Wow.
And so I didn't have any pain or anything like that.
Right. Because isn't that, for some women, isn't this the time when they might experience like back pain and that sort of thing?
Yeah. And it can be, it's different woman to woman, but yeah, back pain is pretty common during pregnancy. And for someone, it might crop up earlier. But yeah, by that third trimester, it's more common. You're losing, obviously you have all this increased weight on the front, and then you're losing a lot of the support of your abdominal wall. Just because like as it gets stretched out, like it's not able to generate as much force. Like, so it's just a weaker contribution basically. And so, but again, that's where like maintaining strength and having a general awareness of like your form and your body movements, can be really important. Cause if you have a strong back, strong glutes, like you can, that relative weight of the baby is less stress for you than somebody that's not as strong. Because now that baby kind of represents a lot more weight relative to what they're able to do. And just, again, being aware of like, I'm a fan of deadlifting. I think people should know how to deadlift. But being aware of like how to like hinge and like load your legs and your glutes versus like just putting all the stress on your back can help as well. Just being like kind of cognizant about how you're moving. Hi, we've had a breach of the door again. Say hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Get out of here.
We're talking about you.
Yeah. We're talking about yeah, that one came out at 9.5 pounds.
That's pretty up there. Functional
but yeah, so awareness of your movement, and that's where like if you haven't done strength training at some point in your life, it could be good to do that during pregnancy. And the other kind of pain that frequently crops up for women is called pelvic girdle pain, and so that's sort of pain in and around the pelvis, and so it can be kind of toward the back, almost when your tailbone is a common spot for it, or in the front, in the pubic symphysis, so kind of where the two sides of your pelvis come together. And so women that are experiencing pain might have to modify their movement some to kind of hopefully avoid aggravating it. But again, I found in general, kind of the healthier and stronger you've gone into your pregnancy, and there's actually research that shows this, the less pain women report during pregnancy. And I like to do like a lot of single leg strengthening also, not just bilateral strength work, because I think kind of the stronger and more functional we have that hip complex, really helps during pregnancy. Because a lot of people will say take out single leg work, which like for some people, especially with the pubic symphysis pain, it can single leg work can provoke pain. But I don't ever like to take it out preemptively. Like if it's a problem for somebody, then we'll reduce it. Because some of those women find more comfort with things where they're both sides of their body are doing the same thing versus the two sides of the pelvis doing something different. But again, like early in the pregnancy, before your pregnancy, doing some single leg work, I think is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I'm just like picturing everything that you're explaining as you're talking through it. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So is there anything else about that third trimester before we kind of move on? Because I want to make sure we have enough time to get to questions as well.
The only other thing that's kind of like a major like pregnancy recommendation is like supine exercise. So like exercise flat on your back usually isn't recommended after like the 20th week. I mean, they keep changing it. They keep pushing it back. Like, well, maybe it's okay 25 weeks in. But if you are laying flat on your back, the baby can sit in such a way that's compressing your inferior vena cava, I think one of the blood vessels. And so it can reduce blood flow to the baby. But that reduction is less if you're exercising. And it's, for short bouts of exercise, like at this point they say like, don't worry about it. So if you're doing like 1 30-second set on your back, I wouldn't worry, but you're not supposed to spend like long periods of time flat on your back after that like 20-ish week. But as long as it's short periods and you're not experiencing any like dizziness or lightheadedness, then that's fine. And you can even just do like a 15-degree incline. So like, let's say you were doing like a bench press, rather than flat on your back, do like a slight incline bench. And then that's, kind of takes away that concern. But yeah, I think we hit most of the major ones. The other big third trimester one I'd say is, we kind of touched on the pelvic floor stuff earlier, but not just learning to contract your pelvic floor, but I also make sure women learn to relax their pelvic floor. Because when you are actually giving birth, you want to kind of be able to relax your pelvic floor, let the baby out. Because if you're contracting while you're trying to push, you're kind of fighting against yourself. So that's another way that doing kind of that pelvic floor work early on can be helpful, like during labor, to like learn to relax it.
Interesting. I definitely did not know that one. No. But again, it makes sense if you think about it. Cool. All right. So then moving on. So after we've had the baby, kind of what postpartum, or what some people might call fourth trimester, that time period once you've given birth and now your body is like in this immediate recovery phase. I know that time can be very different for different moms depending on how they gave birth and just like the state of their body at that point. So what are kind of some differences or considerations that we need to think about and realize that everyone is probably going to be very different at this point?
Yeah. And I like I think you mentioned earlier, I kind of like calling it the fourth trimester because it kind of wraps it into the pregnancy a little bit. Because I think women often give themselves a little more grace with training and stuff during pregnancy. And then once the baby's out, they're like, oh, I should be back to normal. Like I should be able to do all the stuff that I did before. And it still is really a big period of kind of change for your body and for your life. But yeah, so the biggest, returning to exercise, like you said, is going to be really variable. And so kind of some of the biggest things that'll shift, especially that early timeline, are, what kind of delivery you had or how your delivery went. And so if you had a cesarean birth, obviously you're going to have a little bit more time before you're able to begin any sort of exercise. Usually be cleared for exercise at about 8 weeks with a cesarean, because especially early delivery, you're going to be trying to move in ways that you're really not putting any stress on that scar. And so that early recovery can be, it's a little bit harder early postpartum with a C-section, because it is a major abdominal surgery, which I think we a lot of times don't give women credit for. Like, we're always talking about surgeries and they're like, oh, go to C-section, now you're fine, just get back to it. But so those early weeks focusing on just resting, healing, and this is true for a vaginal birth too, eating really nutritious food, bonding with your baby, not worrying about exercising, get some activity if you enjoy it, but like, don't stress about getting back to it quickly. I started about 4 days postpartum with my second, with like rehab type activity, but it's because I wanted it to. It was part of like my mental health, and I had no complications with my delivery or anything. So I didn't have any concerns around that. And like I said, it's really low intensity. It was more like, I would think of it as rehab versus like exercise. And so oftentimes with a vaginal birth, you'll be able to return to exercise a little bit sooner than with a cesarean. Although again, it'll depend a little bit on your delivery. Usually you get cleared at 6 weeks with a vaginal birth. But it's going to depend somewhat on if you had any tearing. And so I was lucky enough not to. I had very minor with my first and then none with my second. So I didn't have to worry about stitches healing or anything like that. But if you have a second, third, or especially 4th degree tear, then that's going to take much longer to heal. And so again, you're going to really need to wait until those stitches heal, wait till you get clearance before you start resuming activity. But then it's really going to be, once you're cleared by your doctor, or, once you feel ready again to do, if you had an uncomplicated vaginal delivery, no tearing, you can start really light activity sooner than the 6 weeks. That's kind of a postpartum myth, is that you can't do anything for 6 weeks and then all of a sudden you can do everything. Which is really not a good way to go about it. Cause like during those 6 weeks, there's things you can do. Like you can do rehab, you can do things that are no more difficult than the activities of daily living is usually kind of what they say. And then once you hit that 6 week clearance, like just remember to ramp yourself up slowly, because your abdominal strength is just not going to be where it was. And your pelvic floor, people I think pay more attention to their core because, you can see it. But the pelvic floor, I think, really needs more attention early postpartum, especially with a vaginal delivery. Like if you want to get back to high impact, things that have a lot of, intra-abdominal pressure, a lot of jumping, making sure you do that pelvic floor rehab to prep yourself is really important.
Yeah, all this is so helpful and so important to hear. And it's just like a wealth of information.
And it's not a race. It's not a race, especially postpartum. It sometimes makes me like a little nervous. I feel like on the show, they're having people earlier and earlier. And I'm like,
I know. I mean, like Lindsay was on here.
Push.
Yeah, Lindsay came on the podcast and talked about it. And I'm just like, wow, like you're amazing. Yeah. How did you do this? But again, thinking, I'm going to pick on Lindsay for a second because I know she won't mind. Like she was an athlete most of her life, and then even though she wasn't competing ninja or like hardcore training ninja throughout between like her first and second, or could be second and third, I might have that wrong, but she had more than one child. But again, it was like her background and her foundation of strength in her body was already there. So I think that definitely had to make a big difference.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And like, I mean, the delivery is always something you don't have control about. But if you had a smooth delivery, then that's, you can start much sooner. And then just like how much sleep and support are you getting and how do you feel like, is really variable.
Yeah.
But yeah, some people are lucky and they just can get back to stuff and they're totally fine.
Yeah. But if that's not you, like if you're listening and you're like, that's not me, like that's okay. Like,
which I think it's not a lot of people. And we kind of see the stories like, people on social media or whoever. I think we see more of that because, that gets posted about versus the women that maybe have a harder time or are struggling. It's just not as visible. And so we feel like, everybody's bouncing back. And I don't think that that's the case. I think the most women, it takes a little bit of time.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. So I'm going to kind of pull up, we had quite a few questions come from listeners from after the first episode aired, and I'm really excited to get into some of these. So I'm going to pull up the list and ask away.
All right.
So the first one I've got here, this person said, I've heard injuries can happen more because of hormonal shifts. How do I know when and where to be careful? So I think we sort of covered this a little bit, but yeah, you can be a little more specific if you want.
Yeah, a little. So I think the concern people have is they hear that like relaxin relaxes all your joints, and so you're like really predisposed to injury or something. But I don't think that really actually bears out. It's not like your joints are like loose and unstable because of relaxin. I've not seen like any higher injury rates. Like as long as you're not going crazy, like, doing just normal exercise activities, you're not like at a higher risk of injury. So that's not something I would really be concerned about. I think the relaxin thing kind of gets overplayed and people are like, oh no, my joints are going to come out of place. And it's like, oh no, you're good. You're okay.
I'm all loosey-goosey now. Yeah. Good to know. All right. Next one. Are there things or movements I should add to my pregnancy training to make birth easier? Good question.
Yeah, so I think the biggest one, like we kind of talked about, was pelvic floor. So learning how to contract and relax your pelvic floor, because during labor, excuse me, sorry. During labor, you want to be able to really relax. In terms of like specific movements, some people add like hip or pelvic work. Like I'll be honest, like if you're generally fit, I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference in terms of your birth. Unfortunately, the birth is kind of a lot of it's like how it's going to happen and that's how it goes. I think we want to be able to control it. But, I think more than like physical prep, a lot of like birth is mental prep, is really the way to like set yourself up. Both in terms of like, learning about the labor and the delivery, but also, maybe practicing some pain management methods, maybe mentally preparing yourself for like what can happen during birth. And maybe you have a fear around a C-section, maybe educate yourself about a C-section or tearing. Yeah.
I think that's mine.
That's your, because I think that the more kind of calm you can be during the actual like delivery process, the better that sets you up. And so ahead of time, addressing your fears, practicing some pain management techniques, knowing what your options are at the hospital just allows you to stay like really in the moment during the actual labor. And so I think setting yourself up mentally is super helpful. And I think as athletes, we have a leg up because we're used to experiencing like physical discomfort that's not bad. Like if you're going to do an all out 400-meter sprint, like you are pushing yourself and that is uncomfortable. It feels terrible. Like 400-meter runners, like good on you. But I had to do that in track in college. I was like, oh, this is awful. But I found myself like actually during my labor using a lot of the same mental techniques that I would use to get through like a really difficult workout. And I think it can be really, really helpful during labor to have that athletic background and have had to push yourself through physical discomfort.
It's like when you're on the course and you're like, oh no, this obstacle is not going how I planned, or this is not how I thought this would feel. Like, don't freak out. You gotta just keep think on the fly and keep going.
It's funny, I did both unmedicated births, and both times when I went to the hospital, they did not believe that I was in labor because I was so calm.
Wow.
It was like the midwife the first time like almost wasn't going to like check me to admit me. And she's like, oh, you can go on a walk around for a little bit. And then she checks me and she's like, I was 7 centimeters and like 90% effaced. And she's like, oh, you're having a baby today. And I was like, oh, I know.
Oh.
I've been in like full on labor for 12 hours now. Like
Oh my gosh.
I'm aware.
I'm aware. Wow. They're like, yeah, I guess you don't need the meds.
Yeah. No, they never even offered them to me. They're like, I'd go over your
Oh
options, but like, you seem to be fine. And I'm like, yeah, I'm good.
Wow. Cool.
But I was more afraid of like an epidural than I'm afraid. Like I have a high pain tolerance.
Okay.
So, like I'll breathe through it. Like it's not enjoyable. But
Yeah.
like, you know, that's where like doing some practice at a time, just like breathing, relaxing, I think can really help.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. Just start writing down our strategies.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one thing I work with my pregnant clients on, especially third trimester, is like mental stuff and like birth prep, because I think it can be really helpful for having that be like a good experience, regardless of what type of birth you want to have.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so I enjoyed this next question a lot. It says, can I do handstands during pregnancy?
Yeah, I got that from a woman that does handstand coaching, and she gets that question. Yeah, so the handstands during pregnancy is kind of an interesting one. So like being up and down or upside down in and of itself is totally fine. I've heard a few like weird things about that, and that's fine. The consideration kind of with handstands would be more like as your weight increases and as your belly gets bigger. So somebody that is like really good at handstands, they're very well practiced, is going to be able to compensate for that much better. So as your body weight and your center of gravity shift, like that's going to be pretty easy for them to balance out and still, you know, be able to maintain balance. And I'm just assuming you're doing just a regular handstand, freestanding handstand. Somebody that's like newer to a handstand practice, once they start getting a belly, I might not recommend it, just because they're going to be less able to control how they come down. And so like, again, like I'm not super worried about like injuring the baby, because like, what are you going to land flat on your belly coming out of a handstand? But somebody that doesn't have as good of control may not come down the way they intended, and they could, you know, hurt themselves. Or even if you were to like totally arch back into like a back bend type thing, like that might not be the best. But somebody that's really, you know, good at handstands, like they may be able to maintain a really nice stable handstand like well into pregnancy. And they have the skill to control how they come down when they do lose their balance. And so they may be able to do it quite far into their pregnancy. I didn't really, just because I wasn't, you know, I've had handstands in and out of my life for a long time, and you know, especially like third trimester, I would have no desire to do a handstand. Like that just sounds uncomfortable, and my belly was huge. And but I've seen women do it. It's usually women with much smaller bellies than I had. But again, like, you know, and I think with a lot of pregnancy, kind of like how long can I keep doing X really depends on like how well conditioned and skilled you are at that before you got pregnant. So like if you look at someone like, let's say they're a climber, they're a really skilled climber, they may be able to climb relatively difficult routes pretty far into their pregnancy, that like to an outsider, it may look irresponsible. But for them, it's like well within their skill set. You know, they're doing routes that they're very, very confident that they're not falling on. And they even make like pregnant harnesses for climbing now that like have like a thing that can go around the belly.
Oh.
But like same thing
That's
for
cool.
running. Like if you're like a really, really like, you know, let's say you're a marathon runner and you get pregnant, you're going to be able to keep running longer distances much longer into your pregnancy than somebody that's like kind of a recreational runner that runs like a mile or two once or twice a week. Because, you know, as your weight increases, that's like kind of more pressure each step. You know, and again, thinking not just in terms of baby, but like mom, like if you're pounding and you're, you know, maybe your hip muscles aren't as strong and things are getting shifted around because, you know, baby, you're more likely to have like pains and like, or like, you know, kind of overuse injuries. And, you know, you're going to have more pounding on the pelvic floor because maybe your form's not as good and you don't decelerate your movements as well. And so for that person, like probably they're not going to run as far into their pregnancy, or I wouldn't consider it appropriate to keep running as long. Whereas somebody that's like a really, really good runner, like maybe they're still running third trimester and, you know, they're going on 5-mile runs, but they used to go on 10-mile runs. And their pace maybe has come down, and it might seem fast to you, but for them, you know, they're still very much in that kind of aerobic zone, and it represents a, you know, something that their body is very, very able to handle. And so kind of like how long you keep doing things will depend kind of on symptoms and how you feel. And like with the handstands, like, you know, I wouldn't keep doing them because like you're worried you'll lose your handstand skills. But if you like enjoy doing handstands, then, you know, keep doing them as long as you feel good doing them and you feel comfortable with how you're able to come down out of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And all those examples, I think, really makes it clear and like helps to put it into perspective. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
And don't assume because you saw someone on social media do something that like it's a good idea for you too.
Right.
Because like, we see all the 1% cases usually, or the people's with like the big followings. And remember, that's not everybody. But like it was funny because I posted a video of me like lifting when I was 41 weeks pregnant. Cause like I was still working out past my due date. So like baby's still in there and I still felt good, but it was funny that I got like, it was like the most, I don't have a big following, but it was the most comments I got on like anything I'd posted ever. And it was just, they're like, oh my gosh, you're so amazing. And all of that. I didn't get any of the negative ones because I don't have enough people that I don't know follow me to get those. But like, I almost regretted posting because like I wasn't doing it to like show how badass like women can still be. I probably shouldn't have used that word while they're pregnant, because I think that sometimes we almost get this like push to be like the like coolest pregnant one out there. Like, what can I still do while I'm pregnant? And I don't think that's a good like mindset either, because for me the weights that I was doing represented like a very small portion of what I'm able to do. So like I was deadlifting like 135 pounds, which for me I can deadlift like 300 pounds. So, you know, that's a weight I could literally do for like 50 reps, and I was doing it for like, you know, 6 or 7. And so like again, like it looks heavy, but for me it represents like a, you know, a big step down. And so I think we can still really, really train, do a lot of hard stuff, but we do need to be smart about it.
Yeah, I love that you share that, because I think very often, I don't know, women, sometimes we tend to put ourselves down or tend to look down on motherhood for whatever reason, whether it's like a stigma or whatever. And so I think sometimes, like you said, if you see a video like, oh, look, this person is doing this and she's pregnant, or like she's doing it, and even though she's pregnant, she's still doing it. And it's like, yeah, these things are harder to do when you're pregnant for all the reasons we just described, but it's like, that doesn't mean that because I'm pregnant or because I'm a mom or whatever, that there's something like less than about me that's like redeemed because I can still work out.
Yep.
And I think sometimes we have that twisted kind of a mindset, and I'm all about just helping women to realize like the value and the amazingness of like just being a mom, and the fact that you can give birth to a child and like raise that child that is one day going to grow up and be an adult like you and me listening to this episode. Like, to me, it's just so cool. And I never want people to forget like how special you are just for the fact that you're a mom. Like, I think it's amazing. So
yeah, I think we get stuck in comparison sometimes. And
yeah. Yeah. All right. So next one, does mobility focus matter more than strength and, let me say this again. Let me start over. Does mobility focus matter more than strength during and post pregnancy? So does focusing on mobility training, is that more important than strength training during and post pregnancy?
So I would say no. And I would actually say the opposite, that strength training is probably far more important. I think people sometimes, I don't know, it's weird. Sometimes like I feel like mobility training gets like held up here, or maybe it's the like yoga thing, like yoga is what you should do during you're pregnant. But I don't think there's, beyond having like, you know, the ranges of motion to be able to do activities well, like normal, you know, exercise or activities of daily living, like there's not an advantage to being like super flexible. Obviously if it's a skill you need for your sport, then that's a different thing. But in terms of just like a healthy pregnancy, I would focus much more on strength training. Like in general for women. I think women are afraid of strength training, but like during pregnancy and then like postpartum, like you're carrying around babies, like it's a very physical job. The stronger you are, the just easier your life is going to be. And there's also really good research into the benefits of strength training during pregnancy. Even if you didn't do it before pregnancy, you can start. You know, I wouldn't work in like those really high like percentages of your 1 rep max. Like you're not going to be doing like 2, 3, 4 rep sets. They're like super heavy, but working in that like 8 to 12 range, you know, even if you've never strength trained before, it's a really good time to start, and I would highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Mobility, I'd say only if it's, you know, if you have limitations that are causing you pain or issues. So maybe if you're really tight from like leaning over the computer all the time, you don't have good shoulder positioning, like doing some like shoulder mobility work, or if you have like really tight hip flexors and it's pulling you into this arched position and it's making you uncomfortable, especially with the growing belly, like stretching your hip flexors could be good. But in general, like I don't think that for most people, mobility work's gonna be like super. I certainly wouldn't put it above strength training.
Got it. Good to know. All right, so the next one, this one is worded quite interestingly, so kudos to whoever's imagination put this one together. So I'm gonna read it, but I'm gonna like explain it at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's the question says, what can I do, add or change now that postpartum I will want to high five my past self for? So what can I do now or change or add or whatever that future me will be like, good job, Kara, way to be, glad you did that.
Yeah, so I'd say 2 things. So I just talked about the strength training, but if you don't do strength training, I would add the strength training in. It will make your life easier. And then the other one I would say is, we talked a little bit about pelvic floor training earlier. If you've never done any, I would start doing that because you can almost think of it as like a skill. Learning how to do voluntary pelvic floor contractions, building some strength, because just like injuries, the stronger it was going in, you're going to be able to get back there quicker. But if you can postpartum, you have already built up that kind of skill set and control. Now I can do my pelvic floor integrated with exercises and really make good use of my time versus if I'm like now postpartum and my pelvic floor got really stretched out and I'm trying to establish a connection for the first time. Because as far as like getting back to high level activity, that's like one of my biggest focuses is getting people's pelvic floor up to speed. So if you do that while you're pregnant, that's a good thing to do. You will high five your past self for doing it.
Nice. Good. All right. What to expect that you might not know about in the prenatal and postpartum phase, particularly with regards to training? So what can you expect that you, like what's good to know about that you might not have expected in prenatal and postpartum phases regarding training?
I feel like pregnancy, we kind of talked about most of kind of, you know, the general experiences. Everybody's just going to differ. I always just say to expect at least one weird thing during your pregnancy. Everybody's going to have at least one weird symptom that you're like, I didn't know that would be a thing, but it is for you. Like my first pregnancy, I lost feeling in these 3 fingers entirely for the last 2 months of my pregnancy. I could not feel anything with these fingers. So it's basically like a form of like carpal tunnel where because of the additional fluid, it compresses a nerve. And so, it was none. And then it took about 2 months postpartum for me to get feeling back. That was not a symptom I was a fan of. But just be like prepared, like expect the unexpected. Something weird will crop, weird and inexplicable, and you might get like weird acne or weird something.
Oh boy, so much to look forward to. I'm gonna lose feeling in my fingers.
That one's not that common. Certainly not to the degree that I had it, but it's not uncommon either to have some form of like carpal tunnel type syndrome during pregnancy, just because of the increased fluid during your pregnancy. I was super swollen during my first pregnancy. Not at all during my second. It was so weird. I was like, I thought they would be about the same, but nope.
Who knew?
Yeah, I know. Just when you think you can like be prepared and count on something. I mean, I was glad that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But
Totally.
But yeah, and then postpartum, I think we kind of covered like, you know, the general stuff that can crop up. But again, I just kind of expect for your body to feel a little bit different, and to give yourself some time, to get back to feeling like normal. Postpartum, it's kind of like, I feel like it's like little stages back to normal. Cause like at first the baby's out and you're like, oh, this is so nice. I don't have that thing inside me anymore. That's like, it was so uncomfortable at the end. You know, but then it's like, you know, you still have your postpartum bleeding. And as soon as that stops, you're like, oh, good, that's better. And like, you know, it's like all these little like, you know, and then you can sit up in bed again because your abs have like started to get a little stronger. You're like, oh, good, that's better. And so I feel like it's like this sort of like, you know, slow progression to like feeling a little bit more like yourself again. And you got to kind of expect that that's going to happen, and it's going to take a little bit of time.
That's a good way to put it. The last question I had here was about myths during pregnancy or postpartum, which I do feel like we touched on quite a few of those, but like, all right, so I bet I can shout some out. So, you know, the whole thought of like, oh no, if I fall, like I'm going to crush the baby, or like something bad's going to happen, or like, you know, just that concept of like falling in training, or like just that anything I could do where I'm getting hit or falling is going to like ruin everything. I think that was the biggest myth to me that I was like, oh, that's good to know.
I mean, still be careful. Like, let's not.
Yeah,
be
no,
falling,
no, I know.
like...
I'm not going to go like tumbling all over, but I guess in my mind, it's like when you bring the eggs home from the grocery store. And
yeah, and you're like super handling the carton. Yeah.
Yeah, like the eggs are in this bag. I'm always like yelling at my husband because he's that guy who will like take all of the grocery bags in his arms, like all like 10 of them or whatever.
Oh, and you're like,
and walk like through the door with all the bags, and he's like trying to get through, and I'm like, there's eggs in there. Like, what are you doing?
That's me also. Like, I'm not making 2 trips. 1 trip.
Yeah, but I think that's what I was picturing, where it's like if anyone bumps me,
then you're like worried.
Happen. Yeah. But any other myths? I think that, you know, I know we went through a bunch, but that was this last question: myths about training while pregnant or postpartum.
No, I feel like we covered. Most of the major ones.
Okay.
There might be a few out there still, but there's a few crazy ones that just like I've heard, like, don't put your arms overhead during your pregnancy.
Oh.
It'll like wrap the cord around the baby. Like I've heard like crazy things, like, but I don't think that's a common one. But I still see people commenting on the internet, and you're like, what are you?
Someone's grandma told them that.
That might be another thing to expect during your pregnancy, is like just lots of unsolicited comments on.
I'm sure.
At least some old guy at the grocery store telling me that I should be like just swimming during my pregnancy, and I'm like, this is what I do, like, literally, and you're some random guy in the grocery store telling me, like, giving me advice on working out.
That's funny. Oh man, well, I love these episodes, like the part 1 and now today part 2 that we've done, because I feel like there's so much to learn, and like it's very interesting. And as athletes, it's like we are in a little bit of a niche community where, like, you know, we have a sport, but then we have ninja, and it's like we do interesting things over here in general anyways. And so then adding pregnancy, it's like, okay, what's some good advice about moving forward and how to think about this and what to expect. So I really appreciate just all of your knowledge and sharing time, like sharing your knowledge and spending time with us today. Where can people contact you if they want to ask more questions, or do you take like one-on-one clients if someone is pregnant and they're like, I'd really love to work with you more intensely?
Oh yeah, so my my social media, probably my Instagram, just at Amy Harski, AMYHARSKI, and you can just DM me there. I'm not super active on social media, but I am on there. I always think that I'm going to start posting more information, and maybe when I have more time, that'll happen. But I will respond. But yeah, and I do. Actually, coming up in January, so I have a little course that I run that's called Understanding the Core and Pelvic Floor for Pregnancy and Postpartum. It's like a 3-week course with there's little homeworks between each week, and so that's a really good place to start if people like want to learn more about this.
Definitely. Yeah. I would love to link to anything you'd like to share. So
I don't have a link, just didn't,
Okay.
I'm not that advanced. Because like
soon.
I have as many clients as I can handle all the time. And so like I've never like promoted myself or like created any like online things. But if somebody wants to know, just just DM me. I do one-on-ones also. And I mostly, I have some people that I work with on a more regular basis, but I mostly work kind of like on a consultant type thing where I work with people, I design programs, and then we do periodic check-ins versus like a, we do twice a week, every week or something like that. Partly because I don't have time for that, and partly because like most of the people I work with don't really need that level of coaching.
Gotcha.
But yeah,
That's
so
good
if
to know.
anybody is interested, do reach out, because that's kind of my favorite group to work with is athletes, especially ninja athletes.
Woohoo.
But
Love it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
No problem. Be strong, be you, be a ninja babe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And this is a lot of fun. I like love talking about all this.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's fun to talk about.